Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Southwest Washington APA October Lunch and Learn. My name is Claire Lust. I work for the city of Ridgefield, and I am one of the professional development co-chairs for Southwest APA. So welcome, everyone. Today we have a really great presentation lined up on the highway system plan update. Before that, we do like to start out our meetings with a 5 or so minute social justice moment. Those of you that have joined Southwest APA webinars previously this year know that we do the social justice moment just as a way to be conscious of the fact that we should be weaving in social justice, equity, cultural competence through all of our actions as planners. So typically this is led by Mike Salas. He's our social justice chair. Unfortunately, Mike was not able to make it today, but I do have something quick to share with you all. One moment here. That's not it, sorry. All right, so the concept I'd like to briefly introduce today is the cultural iceberg. As we know, in an iceberg, only about 10% is visible above the water and the majority is hidden beneath the surface. So back in the 70s, Edward Hall suggested that culture was similar to an iceberg. That culture has two main components. About 10% of culture is external or surface culture and is easily visible. And then about 90% of culture, which he called internal or deep culture, is hidden below the surface. So that external or surface culture is comprised of behaviors, traditions, and customs that are easily observable. They are easily changeable. They're learned explicitly and are comprised of mostly objective knowledge. And then below the surface, that vast 90% of the cultural iceberg, we have core values, beliefs, attitudes, priorities, perceptions that are more difficult to observe. These are also difficult to change. They're often unconscious and learned implicitly and comprised of mostly subjective knowledge. So I feel like this is an interesting concept to think about as planners, since we are often interacting with both individuals and groups from cultures that are different than our own, be that community groups or even just different departments within our own offices. And based on this model, we can start to really think about how our first interaction with someone from a different culture or a group from a different culture is that tip of the iceberg, and that we can make assumptions or develop ideas about a cultural community without really understanding that deep or internal culture that makes up the majority of their values and beliefs. So the question I'd like all of us to take with us today and think about both in our work lives and our personal lives is, what's in your own cultural iceberg? Thank you. So with that, I would like to introduce our guest speaker today. Please welcome Jeremy Jukes. Jeremy has served the interests of Washington for 15 years at WSDOT. As a project manager for the highway system plan, he is able to draw on experience in project planning, program management, and project delivery. Jeremy, thank you for being here today so much. Please take it away.
All right, let me just get this started. And where were the options last time I started this? I think this is the right one. So everybody should be able to see a presentation screen where it's the intro with the highway system plan for all modes. Can I confirm that's there? All right. So good afternoon. I want to say first and foremost, the Southwest Washington is a little near and dear to my heart. Straight out of university, the first job I had was with WSDOT in the Vancouver offices. I have since worked throughout the state, but you always remember where you start. Also, a quick reminder, because this meeting is recorded, of course, everybody can see this, so please be respectful and professional. I wanted to touch on a couple of things this afternoon. First and foremost, the highway system plan overall, what it is, why we're updating it now, the process we're going through, the equity approach that's part of that, talk a bit about scenarios and outreach, and then make sure we've got some time for Q&A. We'll WSDOT 101 ahead of that as well. And should be about 30 to 40 minutes of presentation with a few questions mixed in. Should have about 10, 15 minutes of open Q&A at the end. Also got a little additional material depending on how that time works for us. So to kick us off, I'll start with a quote here that transportation planning must be cooperative because no single agency has responsibility for the entire transportation system. And if I can add on to that a little bit, no single plan has responsibility for the entire transportation system either because it's too high level and it doesn't get to details, or because it's only for a certain portion of that. So the state's transportation network is a connected system that must serve many modes, many users. And since the 1970s, when the Department of Highways became the Department of Transportation, WSDOT has responsibilities related to all of these areas. Highways are made of roads and bridges. Puget Sound has one of the largest ferry systems in the world. Many of the routes are, the ferry routes are also state highways. There are 32 transit systems in the state. Many rely on state highways to operate. WSDOT operates 16 airports, administers 333 miles of intercity passenger rail and 300 miles of freight railroad. In addition, there's 125 miles of dedicated bike lanes and 405 miles of sidewalk in and adjacent to WSDOT right-of-way. And as noted here, that many of those are ultimately the responsibilities of local jurisdictions. Calling back to that opening quote, planning happens at many scales within Washington. So each portion of the integrated multimodal system is covered by at least one long-range plan. That includes the overarching multimodal plan, the Washington Transportation Plan, which covers all of transportation at the policy level. Our focus today is on the statewide plan for interstates, US routes, and state routes that make up the highway system. We plan under the legislature's 6 transportation policy goals listed here. In addition to be compatible with other statewide plans, we also complement the metropolitan, regional, local, and corridor network plans that happen in the state. Kind of one quick caveat here, the ferry routes that are state highways are covered under the ferries plan rather than the highway plan, just for putting like infrastructure together, I think is the organizing principle there. And last kind of thing I'll touch on kind of in the big picture here, there's a vision for transportation that's laid out in the Washington Transportation Plan, which is about a system that safely connects people and communities, it fosters commerce, it operates seamlessly across boundaries, and it provides travel options to achieve an environmentally and financially sustainable system. So with that, I think that's something of a quick overview before we really dive in deep. And I think there's one good question from the group before we get into the specifics of the highway system plan. And we'll do a few question pop-ups like this going through if anybody has a question. A shy group today. Okay. So I mentioned earlier, it's one of the plans that's listed in statute here. This is the first sentence of the law kind of broken out into pieces here. And you can see that the plan identifies program and financing needs, recommends specific and financially realistic improvements. That's all to order to accomplish three things that are very natural to us transportation professionals, where we preserve the structural integrity of the state highway system, we ensure acceptable operating conditions, and we provide for enhanced access to scenic, recreational, and cultural resources. Our purpose and need for the plan is built off this statutory framework, and the two items in red are a special emphasis for this update. So taking a look at the projects that were present in 2007 highway system plan is out of scope for this effort. 2007 was the last year this plan was updated. There are 5 different elements required under the RCW here. Looking at taking care of the system, we have both the preservation of roads, bridges, and other assets, as well as highway maintenance, which makes sure that everything continues running and operating. We have the capacity and operational element, which touches on almost every aspect of how vehicles move on the system, as well as an element on scenic and recreational highways and an element on paths and trails. I think that last one, if it was rewritten today, would probably be called active transportation, because it is about non-motorized transportation in the state. So this specific update, the previous slides were kind of in general. Now this specific update, the purpose of planning, of course, is to inform decision-making. Given the challenges our agency faces, WSDOT leadership felt the decision that was most important to inform is what the right mix of funding is for programs. The other objectives articulated by leadership included ensuring that there's rigorous community engagement, that we address all highway modes, that we develop specific performance-based criteria to evaluate future investments. There's a few scenarios that we expect to see through our work. So a baseline scenario, which is what we currently have funded. The vision scenario explores what it takes to implement the highway portion of the overall vision for transportation. And there's room for intermediate scenarios we tackle along the way. So more on that a bit later. The underlying idea here is very simply that if you don't fund the system you want, you get the system you fund. The trade-offs come in different forms of different amounts of and mixes of funding that give us different kinds of performance, and that's where the trade-offs really happen. The purpose and need for the plan starts with the purpose here. So it's identifying programming financing needs to really just, as you can see, it's built straight off of our vision, where it's preserving, it's improving safety, it's maximizing that operational efficiency with what we've got now, and providing people with travel choices. And this update will guide the corridor subarea network planning by providing some common language for communicating agency priorities and strategies, inform legislative proposals, including how WSDOT intends to achieve legislative policy goals and what level of program funding is needed to do that, and to facilitate external coordination and alignment with other state, regional, and local agencies that are involved in implementation. In terms of how we're doing it, there's a bit of the process of where are we at right now. Based on the direction for this plan, our team charted a course for completing the work. It created a governance structure to inform how to guide that work. We've made some significant progress on the technical analysis in particular. So you can see the little red car at where we're at on the journey. So we worked with the different programs to articulate what needs and opportunities they face over the next 20 years. And then a smaller group of them that we'll talk about more a little bit later took the additional of establishing some performance metrics that we were able to use in our survey so that we can show how different levels of program funding will affect their performance. We have a financial group, which is supported by insights and expertise from the different governance bodies that navigated the uncertainties of the future to establish a baseline forecast and to estimate reasonably expected revenues through 2040. We also are looking at level of service for highways of statewide significance. That's part of the highway system plan, and this working group is working to understand what the traditional level of service measures are and how they're woven into the agency fabric, when they're helpful, when they're not, and what alternatives might help WSDOT better achieve our strategic plan goals. We've adopted and are working to implement an equity approach consistent with the HEAL Act and is supported across the WSDOT business areas. That brings us really to the approach on our scenario stage of work We've been working with our communities to interpret that vision for transportation and understand the opportunities, challenges, and trends that we should pay attention to when considering that range of future scenarios. Starting early on, we had a lot of different seeds that could be things that lead to different scenarios. So for example, you can see the quotes here. So really, what are we talking about when we're talking about a scenario? We are talking about illustrating distinct policy choices that people care about. Scenarios would illustrate the future outcomes of those choices so people can better understand the trade-offs. Will WSDOT have a preferred scenario? Yes, of course. But only presenting the preferred scenario doesn't help people understand why it is the best one that can be presented. And one last thing on the process here, we're going through 3 main steps within that scenario analysis piece. One is it's a lot like an EIS process in some ways, where we're putting that full range of scenarios out onto the table so that we're not eliminating things before we've even looked at them. That said, we know there's a baseline scenario, we know there's the vision scenario, and then really in that intermediate range where funding increases are likely to happen, we're going to spend a bit more focus. We know that these could help us answer questions like, what if new funding emphasized preservation and maintenance, or what did it emphasize capacity expansion or systems, operations, and management? How rough will the roads be? Will bridges close or be weight restricted? And what are the effects on travel and emissions? Those are all fairly weighty considerations, and we'll be taking it carefully as we go through that. So the number of scenarios we're looking at will get quite a bit bigger as we go through this. And we also know it's not reasonable to fully analyze every single one of those. So industry experts recommend limiting the number to about 3 or 4 that are seriously considered. So we'll be using a series of factors to really focus in on the most relevant scenarios for the plan. We're also looking at, one of the literature reviews we did recommended we look at scenarios that resonate with outside stakeholders. And also that we understand that this isn't a perfect, precise process that's going to give us exact things. It's more art than science. So it's a way to explore these trade-offs and help people better understand the outcomes and potential return on investment. All right, get another quick pause here. So before I jump to the equity approach, I can take one question.
Jeremy, there are a couple questions in the chat. One I think is pretty quick, which is, will we be able to share the PowerPoint to participants after this meeting?
Yeah, definitely.
Great, thank you. So yes, we will send that out. And then a more in-depth question is it possible to share any results of your equity analysis with the group?
Let's see if we can get to that a little bit. I do have a couple of slides in reserve that kind of have the results. So I'll talk a little bit about what our equity approach is and then see if we can get to that other more detailed question.
Yeah, I think that would be really interesting to see. Thank you.
Great. All right. So forging ahead here. It's perhaps no surprise to this group. Equity's received a lot of renewed attention over the past couple of years. In particular, it's got a long-standing tradition of having importance, but that has been brought to a higher level recently. So between the HEAL Act that was passed on recommendations from the Governor's Environmental Justice Task Force, WSDOT crafted this equity approach for this highway system plan update, which is really the most ambitious approach on this topic that the highway system plan has ever really gone after. And so you can see the 6 here on the left that we'd be looking at of, what are our desired outcomes? What does the data tell us? How should the community be engaged? Who benefits, who burdens? What strategies of mitigation should we pursue? And how will we hold ourselves accountable? And there's some caveats that come with this, of course. So there's certain things that apply to this plan, and there are other things that are very relevant, but not part of this plan as well. So there's 4 areas that we see as being particularly relevant here. One is looking at the outreach goals. Our outreach goals, who are we trying to reach out to? Identifying socioeconomic gaps and disparities by geography. informing our project selection criteria, which would be later on in the process that when we get to that, and then also recommending how to evaluate and report on future progress. Some of the stats we do have so far, this is data that has been parsed by us, but really is available to anyone. Demographic is the foundation for a lot of this effort. And so number one, who are the communities of color? Where are the people who have limited English proficiency? And then as well, I'll get to two more, but I've got a couple of talking points first. First is that geography for communities of color, low English proficiency populations, and low income communities are really quite similar, but the disability map is a little bit different. So there's three that are fairly correlated, one that's not. Another note is that most of Metro Seattle has a higher percentage of people of color and with limited English populations compared to the rest of the state. And in urban areas, poverty appears more heavily concentrated than the other demographic variables. And so here's a display of the other pieces here. And I'll share this with everybody so you get a chance to dive into this more if you're interested. All right. So when we talk about a scenario, what are we even talking about? First of all, there's really three pieces of that come together to make up an idea of a scenario. So there's that description, there's, what is it we're even talking about? There's the funding split and amount. So how big is the pie? How is the pie split up into different purposes? And then really, what are the outcomes? What are the performance or other kind of things that happen as a result of applying this split of funding to future investments? How we're organizing some of this work, here's kind of a little bit of a dive, kind of looking at how some of this gets split out at different scales. So at the simplest level, you have what we're doing to fund keeping things that are already there, that have already been built, those past investments that have happened. There's also what we fund about making changes. Some of you may have heard WSDOT messages around state of good repair that, first and foremost, let's keep what we've got, and then let's improve safety. Those are really our top priorities. From then, let's look at the efficiency measures when we're dealing with congestion. Operations and TDM, kind of the TISMO world, if that rings a bell for you, are really the most effective tools we've got for that. And expansion is useful in strategic applications and as a kind of last resort is our general message. Environmental considerations are also on the list. And so we've got that represented. We've got those into 9 different program areas. You can see on the far right here, each representing a major body of work. Now, this isn't the full gamut of everything WSDOT does, but we saw that as a good starting point where number one, we had information and data to talk about that we could stand behind. And number two, that it provides a reasonable indicator for these different areas. I could probably spend more than an hour on each one of those. So happy to take questions as we go. Highways or something. Last time I ran the numbers, about a third of WSDOT's budget. So it's a very big and complicated area. So for example, you might notice WSDOT has a fish passage program. That's a big kind of investment. That's a big commitment. That's not on this list. Part of that is because we saw that is a baseline thing. It's a commitment, it's funded. So it's really not in the debate of how much should we fund it. It's a requirement for us. So that's something that did not make the list, but is very noteworthy.
Jeremy, we do have a, I think, always timely question in the chat about climate change. Can you go into any more detail on how WSDOT's looking at the vulnerabilities of its asset to climate change, and if and how there will be strategies for climate change adaptation in this update?
Yeah, we're looking at this from 2 different, looking at climate change from 2 different angles, and I appreciate the specificity about adaptation on that as well. One is on what are the metrics and outcomes. Greenhouse gases is one of the most direct contributors to climate change, and in this plan, we're doing some modeling work to understand what kind of greenhouse gas emissions, what that future looks like under different scenarios for different funding scenarios here. So that's number one, is even before we get to the adaptation question, what is our contribution to that world? Secondly, or not ours, but the state's. Secondly, on the adaptation front, we're going to be working with our resiliency working group within WSDOT to get a better understanding of what that looks like and what that adaptation really includes. We already know examples of, there's a place called Washaway Beach, which kind of speaks for itself. So what would it take for us to fully adapt to that is the kind of question we'd be asking. So I hope we get more information on that in the future, and we'll take that question as far as we can. We're running a little bit ahead, so I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into this slide than what I've got right here. We've done a fairly soft launch on our online engagement, and we expect to really ramp this up in the next month or so. One of the really notable topics here is a survey and an opinion poll, which are two separate things that are very related. We contracted with the University of Washington and conducted a survey in August and September. We're expecting that report to be finalized by the end of the year, and we can talk a bit about that in a second. And we're using the same set of questions in an online opinion poll that you can find through our open house. And in fact, we've got a special invitation for folks that I'll talk about after I go through one additional piece here. So that'll be a special link just for this group. The thing I wanted to touch on was what are some of the kind of scenario concepts we've heard so far. Here is a scenario. This aligns somewhat closely to WSDOT's proposal to the Office of Financial Management before the rest of the budget process. And as you can kind of see here, these are talking about relative priorities. So this doesn't have numbers attached to it. This doesn't have the performance outcome. So this is kind of like the concept that would go into creating a scenario. And this really says, you know, we're funded at half of what we need for preservation and maintenance. Let's fund that. And then if we get extra funding, safety would be our next priority. And then everything else should come after those things are put forward. There's kind of a competing concept to that, which has really been the story of WSDOT for the last 20 years. Again, this is talking about relative expenditures. It's not talking about absolutes. And so roughly the story for the last 20 years that WSDOT has been directed to build different interchanges, the things I brought on board to help build in 2006 from Nickel, TPA, and Connecting Washington. And we're in the middle of one of the biggest delivery budget that WSDOT has ever had for building new things. And that's really come at the expense of other areas, especially when you take into account lost buying power over the last 20 years. If you start looking at that vision for highways, what that really looks like, it starts, there's some room for variation and interpretation in that. But fundamentally, the priorities are preservation, safety are our top priorities. We look at the efficiency things with operations, travel options, and active transportation is very high. And the newer and bigger highways is used, but it's more of a last resort. And again, relatively low doesn't mean zero, but it's relatively low compared to the other things. Environmental has a variety of range of interpretation on that. The true interpretation of that would be that environmental priorities would be fairly high. Another concept we've run across so far has been something around a TISMO fantasy is the term we've heard. So transportation systems management and operations, looking at those really those efficiency measures that we'd be doing. Active transportation, increasing travel options, and operations is very high priorities along with maintenance. That our preservation and safety would also be priorities, but we wouldn't necessarily max them out. And that building new things is very much de-emphasized. Environmental isn't necessarily part of this core idea, although there's a very closely related one where environmental is also a very high priority. One other idea is kind of a peanut butter approach, so to speak, where everybody gets a little bit. We do a little bit of something for everybody, and we spread the funding in terms of outcomes relative to these different areas. So that's a kind of quick introduction on several pieces here. And take this in. The opinion poll is the other piece, and we look at several different areas here. You can see the 9 programs that we talked about earlier are kind of the core here. Those are the main categories, and then it gives some options for different funding levels, the outcomes that come with it. We found it takes about, depending on how much reading you do for your job, 5 to 10 minutes to take it. So it's not super intensive. And the goal is, given a budget, how would you split that? And we are definitely interested in hearing how people would do that. I think I'll pause there.
Jeremy, would you like me to pop the link to that poll in the chat?
Yeah. As I mentioned, I'm going to go back on the slides here. The link in chat is going to be for this group only. The link on the Engage WSDOT site is going to be for anybody else. So sharing with your friends, your family, your coworkers, your stakeholders, your enemies, whoever else. We can use this online Engage site to reach out and get information that way. Yeah, I think that's good, as long as we are, so I got the chat up here as well. So we can share the link with other APA Southwest section members, but as long as we include that instruction of the link for you and the link for everybody else. We will be, Amy. So is WSDOT using social media to let more people know about the engagement opportunities? We're bringing a consultant on board. We're in the process of negotiating that. And that would be part of our approach, is to really get the word out and get more opportunities for input so more people can weigh in. And all of this is prior to the kind of standard requirements that go, or expectations, I should say, that go with when the plan itself is put together, the review process and those kind of things. So this is, as we are developing the plan, we're seeking input along the way.
I'm interested in the format of the poll, kind of the idea of giving people a way to sort of budget different items. Is that something that you've done before for other projects, and how's it worked?
This will be my first time implementing it. I have seen it before, so I will let you know how it goes when we get a little further through it. Right now, I've seen a couple of preliminary results that are very much still need to go through the full process, and I'm really excited to see what the results are. I'm really glad we're be able to partner with the University of Washington on this. They got the idea we were going for early on and said, yes, in fact, there's a way of doing that. There's a whole set of background for how to analyze it, how to understand it, how to ask the questions. And we've really been leaning on their expertise to help guide that process. Key question here, when are we anticipating completion of the HSP? I probably could have had that in my process diagram. We're expecting it to be done at the end of our fiscal year, which is the middle of next year. So give or take June next year is our target completion. So maybe we could do a little bit of open dialogue here. So we've got the questions that are in the piece there, and maybe we could kind of openly talk about what kind of scenario would you create if you had kind of your druthers looking at highways and what that future would look like. Be happy to engage with either one person and talk through, or with the group if you'd be willing to share. And we found that we tend to ask open-ended questions on this because everybody starts from a different place. One of the things we find in this kind of work very frequently is sometimes we hear the same words and people will be very insistent about the words we use. And then it turns out they're talking about very different ideas along the way. And that's always exciting to work through, kind of that cultural competency piece we started off with. And so then we ask the opening questions, we find out where they're at, we have some dialogue around it. And that helps clarify things. And it also helps clarify, sometimes people use very different language to talk about the same idea. And we've been able to make quite a few strides in at least understanding where people are coming from in that kind of an approach. So this is a question we do frequently get, is like, where is it best to start the planning for this? And there's some good arguments to make about different approaches on this. At the end of the day, the budget for highways is set by the state legislature. And most of, what's the right way to start this? Several of the programs we operate end up doing prioritization across the entire state. And so do you really want different kind of outcomes for whether or not roads are closed or those kind of things? How much differential do you want to see between different counties is part of the question. So part of why we ask this at the statewide level is that the legislature ultimately sets the budget for us, and that many of the things that they set are at the programmatic level. So we're aligning it with the levers they specifically do. When it comes to the specific improvements, particularly as things are changing though, a statewide plan is probably not the best tool to figure out, well, is it better to, for example, use a signal here or a roundabout here at this intersection for the right traffic control device? That's not really a statewide planning question. You want a much more localized plan, either at a local or county level, kind of to take a look at that. Regional models are definitely important. We partner with MPOs and RTPOs in doing forecasts and doing cooperative planning in those forums. And so to that point, it's a yes and question. Yes, we want to leverage the local knowledge where it exists, and the higher level programmatic planning we're doing here is still talking about, overall as a state, what are we doing as kind of a core direction versus what things should be more flexible and more tailored to individual areas. So I hope that answers your question. And specific regions, yes, kind of, depending on what you mean. So our outreach strategy hasn't been totally crafted yet, but we do have responsibilities for reaching out to the entire state, which does include every region. So we'd be touching on Southwest Washington as well as everybody else. Good questions.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. To bounce off that question I popped in the chat, is there going to be, I guess, coordination with our local WSDOT offices at all as like an intermediary between the state and the local level?
Yeah, we're still working out the logistics for exactly how to make that happen, but we'd be connecting with both the folks in Southwest Washington, as well as, if we're doing something from, say, the WSDOT Twitter feed that hits a lot of folks across the entire state, it's going to be a mix of things that are headquarters led, things that are region led. And we're really trying to get all channels kind of working together and complementing each other through the output.
That's great. I think, um, yeah, probably more people here than just me have definitely worked with WSDOT at kind of a hyper local level. So it's interesting to hear about the big picture um, and think about how that all fits together. I know you mentioned at the start of your presentation how a lot of the work of WSDOT does happen in close coordination with local jurisdictions, and that is absolutely the case. So yeah, it's super valuable to both continue thinking about that and see this from a different, much broader perspective.
Yeah, it one of the things we find, yeah, thank you. And one of the things we really find is that connecting some of these broad policy things, even though they're fundamentally underpinning what happens at a local level, sometimes we find they're fairly abstract and not everybody kind of latches onto, oh, if you're talking about this, these are the outcomes that come with that kind of decision. But those are the decisions that are being made. So yeah, it's always good to connect with everybody that we can to help ensure that there's understanding of what's happening and be able to make those connections. A couple more questions from chat here. Judith asking about stormwater. Does it include fish passages? The short answer is no. And sort of. So fish passage is a little bit of a proxy for environmental priorities more broadly. But we specifically excluded it from the survey because we are under an injunction to implement that, and we view it as a given in our discussion. From what I understand of the discussions with the state legislatures, there's every intent to pull through on the mandate that we've got here. And so it's not really a question of will we be doing it, but specifically stormwater is about treating both flow control as well as eliminating pollutants from water that runs off the roadway. And that's what the retrofit is about. How much input and influence do local MPOs in the state have with the state legislature, I think is what that's supposed to say, in terms of final approval of the plan. So the final approval of this plan, as a cabinet agency, our final approval is through the Secretary of Transportation, who was appointed by the governor and confirmed by the legislature. So that's where kind of the political approval goes. That said, we are partnering very closely with MPOs and RTPOs in development of this. I think we've had more coordination with the directors of those groups than we have with any other single group to date. And they've been very informative in terms of helping us understand what the different regional priorities are across the state. It's the short version we found so far is that really everybody follows the 6 transportation planning policies set out by the legislature. There's different flavors and there's different methods of implementation, and some of the things have different, we'll call them emphasis areas in each part of the state, where either local values or local priorities or just the stage of development folks are at, their feeling needs come out a little bit different. Are you thinking, yeah, safety, how do we include the other strategies? So fundamentally, this is a WSDOT plan about WSDOT's in some ways. The Target Zero plan that folks may be familiar with includes strategies, the engineering side of things. So we're focusing on engineering, but we know it doesn't work without education. It doesn't work without enforcement. And it doesn't work without the other core strategies that are really essential to making a true safe systems kind of an approach. Yeah, it's been, the last time the highway system plan was updated was the same year that the iPhone was released, and it's been interesting to and tragic to see that the trend that we've had for years and years on the safety front is now reversed. And we're seeing the trend going the wrong direction. And we'd love to see that revert again. So this is a fantastic question about from Chris, that how much variability do we handle in the scenarios about the federal funding packages or other things that might go into this. Fundamentally, the variable we're exploring here is what happens to the funding. So we're not necessarily, we're being a bit agnostic about what the source is. So whether that's through state or federal funding sources, that's not the key question. The question is, once you get the funding, how is it spent? So that's really where the focus is there. In terms of other variables outside of this, we're still looking at them broadly. We spent quite a bit of effort on that with the Washington Transportation Plan update, the one we completed in 2017. But that said, it'll be less emphasized in this, but we're still considering it, at least to some degree. So, for example, climate change is not going to make a huge impact in terms of, say, the life of a bridge, unless something happens like a lot of things are actually independent of some of those things, particularly when it comes to our core assets. Other things like technology changes, particularly around shared mobility, micromobility, those kind of things, those are big unknowns in our future. I think cities get hit by some of them more than we do, but we're certainly paying attention to them and trying to figure out where exactly is that going to go. One of the phrases I've heard recently is that the days of fixed plans are gone. And so we're really trying to keep an eye of what is the most resilient kind of recommendation that we can make to be true regardless of how variation happens. So I expect that's going to be one criteria that we look at as we're considering what way to go. There's a lot that we go into with that question as well. When I first started pulling this together, I was afraid we wouldn't have enough time to get through the material. But I'm excited to see that this group is definitely, it seems like, getting what we're looking at, kind of the questions we're asking, and I look forward to connecting with you as we learn more.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks to everyone who's contributed questions. Judith's blown her budget here in the survey. Yeah, I think this Q&A has been really interesting. Jeremy, before we lose you, is there anything, any pet issues or interest related to the HSP that you'd like to soapbox on for a few minutes?
There's one thing I have to be careful with that one. I mean, ultimately, I think maybe my soapbox is, my opinion doesn't matter in the long run, would be my soapbox. Certainly I have a view on transportation, but my job is to reflect the views of everybody else. And so we're looking at what Washington residents, businesses, travelers, what are the state interests? That's really the thing we're focused on as a team here. That shouldn't be colored by the person who happens to have this job, I don't think. So that's a big part of where we're going. And really our job as professionals then is to, and when I say our in this case, I mean our team specifically, our job is to understand the values and preferences and compare that with the technical information that says, are you actually getting the thing you want if we go down this path? And so that's really one thing I'd like to see out of this effort, is that we do, we're kind of true to that approach and that method of, I think it is part of our stewardship responsibilities that we're trying with this, and it's a job to see it through. The over budget by 1.57 billion, you're not the only one having trouble keeping the outcomes in budget. There are 3 areas on that survey where if you max those out, any one of those 3 things out, almost everything else has to be minimized in order to stay within budget. And we didn't cap those out because most you could spend in those areas. We capped them out because given this hypothetical constraint, what would that actually, kind of look like? And you really couldn't spend more without breaking the budget somewhere else. So that was one of the things we did put some thought into as the questions were, as we pulled together the questions with the University of Washington. And I think if there's a point from this, it's doing this work can be hard. The legislature's got a really tough job in terms of setting what those priorities are. People, particularly when some of the expectations are not necessarily achievable from a financial standpoint, what trade-offs do we make and what things do we choose not to do? Yeah, that's my little soapbox.
Thank you. That's
There's
a great soapbox message. And yeah, to echo Judith in the chat there, thank you so much for your time. This was incredibly informative. I know personally, knowledge-wise, I was starting from zero, so this is super great information to have. And like we've mentioned a couple times here earlier, there have been a couple questions. We will be sending out the PowerPoint and the link to the survey with the note that it is to be kept internal to our group. And yeah, I'm sure Jeremy is available for further questions, comments, as this project continues. So thanks for attending, everyone. And again, thank you, Jeremy, very much.
Thank you, everybody.